In my main video, Holes, Scotland's Salmon Scandal, I dealt all too briefly with 15 problems associated with farming salmon in nets at sea. The section on sea lice was necessarily concise, but too concise. I'll repeat it before launching this new presentation. 4. Infestations of sea lice, multiplied to catastrophic levels within the nets on high-density salmon, which they eat alive. Requires treatment with very nasty pesticides which contaminate the seabed, the seawater and the salmon. And 5. Sea lice become resistant to treatment. Caged salmon, and therefore the aquaculture industry, are plagued by pests and diseases. Fish-nibbling sea lice are particularly virulent, so that salmon farmers have to fight dirty in their attempts to control them. They use an array of horribly toxic chemotherapeutants, the efficacy and environmental fate of which are beyond highly questionable. They also have some non-chemical methods, such as the thermolyser, a warm bath which has been known to cook the salmon alive, and when it doesn't quite, the procedure kills plenty of them anyway. Then they use cleaner fish, which are supposed to eat the lice. They too are questionable due to limited effectiveness, ecological problems caused by their being harvested from the wild, and as usual sheer cruelty. Sometimes little stinging jellyfish, Pelagia noctiluca, get into the nets in shoals. As some fish farmers have found out the hard way, they seem to enjoy killing captive salmon. Here are just 3 of the chemotherapeutants used today. Many have been abandoned or prohibited. Hydrogen peroxide and formaldehyde are also used. As its latest response to serial failure to evict the sea lice, the industry has begun trialling the notorious neonicotinoid pesticide Imidocloprid. Unlike other sea lice remedies, emamectin benzoate is administered to infested salmon in their feed. The concentration, 0.02%, is substantially lower than is used on land, 0.5%, but once devoured it goes straight to source, none wasted as with crop spraying other than in uneaten pellets. If you can find hazard warning notes, they're alarming. This is very toxic stuff which manufacturers prefer not to stress. But here's one. Environmental hazards. This pesticide is toxic to fish, birds, mammals and aquatic invertebrates. Do not apply directly to water, to areas where surface water is present, or to intertidal areas below the mean high water mark. One might speculate about this stuff. The toxin is ingested. Its purpose is to be eaten by the sea lice which it kills, so it must migrate to the surface muscles and skin. Therefore, en route, it must necessarily suffuse the entire fish. Is it possible that residues persist in the salmon flesh at slaughter? We are uncertain and viewers are left to reach their own conclusions. Emamectin resistance has become a serious problem to the salmon farmers who have to use equally nasty alternatives or pesticide cocktails. Now, the new presentation. Are you horrified by parasites? I'm afraid I won't be able to make this presentation any more palatable, and I don't want to because it deals with a truly nasty animal. Sea lice are very, very unpleasant, but some parasitic crustaceans to which they're related are much worse, certainly to us human observers. Parasites are downright horrible. Allow me to introduce you to Lerniosera branchialis, my most hated. This relative of the crabs, prawns, lobsters and sea lice too has a quite attractive, minute, free-swimming, free-twitching planktonic larva, but it also has 2 parasitic stages, one where it attaches itself to a flatfish or a lumpsucker, and its final reproductive stage on cod and its relatives. When mature, the fertilized female attaches herself to a cod's gills and transforms into little more than a disgusting blood pump, feeding organ and egg factory. It develops a sort of root thing that worms its way into the fish's heart, where it branches into the arteries to feed on cod blood, with the sole purpose of nourishing its eggs. I've seen and handled these gruesome animals, so with vivid recollection of my own revulsion, I'm reluctant to impose them any more graphically on you here. This old drawing will suffice. You'll find an explicit photo of 2 of these horrors on the Lerniosera Wikipedia entry. Salmon infested with sea lice will provide enough stomach-churning imagery for the eyes and minds of the sensitive. The term sea louse can refer to an assortment of creatures, so because Google can throw them up all at once, we better sort out which is relevant here. Some so-called sea lice resemble wood lice, some little ones of which can give swimmers a nasty nip. Others aren't crustaceans at all, but tiny stinging jellyfish larvae that get into people's bathing suits and, depending on how many, can provide swimmers with a painful rash to contend with. The sea lice that concern us here feed only on fish, to which they attach as larvae and nibble at the skin and surface muscle throughout their residence. A fish can cope with a few, an average of between 0.04 and 0.15 per fish is normal, but more than 11 on a pre-adult fish known as a smolt can be fatal. Adult farmed salmon often have to tolerate many more than that, and the injuries caused by being eaten alive by armies of sea lice can be severe. These images and many more were obtained by submerging a camera in salmon farm cages by critic Corin Smith. People around the world are plunging their own underwater cameras into fish farms, discovering that such scenes are commonplace. Here's a wild adult sea trout carrying many more than the lethal minimum number of adult sea lice. The inset shows a juvenile whose infestation we will examine in detail. Still at sea, it's infested with around 500 small sea lice. With luck, if it swims into the freshwater of the Avon Glass River, many will jump ship before they are able to inflict fatal damage. But if it was heading out to sea when it was caught, well, its future seems doubtful. Here is our juvenile sea trout, photographed alive but anaesthetised during a scientific assessment. On recovery, it was released. It has an unnaturally intense infestation of sea lice, totalling an estimated 500 individuals, of the order of 5,000 times the load it might normally expect to carry. This is not an unusual case now we have salmon farms in adjacent sea areas. Does this correlation represent a causal link? That's what we're here to discuss. The sea louse of greatest concern in Scottish waters is Lepiophthirus salmonis. Under natural conditions, it affects wild salmonids, notably Atlantic salmon and sea trout, but only in low numbers with no detrimental impacts on populations of those fishes. Note, that is under natural conditions. However, fish farms full of tightly packed salmon are an open invitation to naturally occurring sea lice that enter the cages, infest the fishes, and multiply to epidemic proportions. That always happens when you keep a single species crammed together for food production. Pests and diseases have a high old time where food is abundant and takes no effort to find. Eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we shall reproduce and eat some more. We're currently experiencing this phenomenon with the invasive non-native species known as SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. As the sickly, injured salmon illustrate, this is a severe problem for the salmon farmers. But nature suffers too. Millions of lice spill out of the cages and attach themselves to passing wild fishes, becoming an ecological problem of potentially catastrophic scale. In Scotland, Ireland, Canada, Chile and Norway, wild salmon are on the brink of extinction. A single individual fish that features frequently in this and many other presentations is this sea trout, netted during a survey by the harbour at Gairloch, west of Ross, where the Avon Glass River meets the sea. None of the many lice on our fish has yet reached adulthood, and the majority, attached to the fins of its undersurface, are recently settled nymphs, preparing for their migration to the skin. They will probably shred the fins before moving on. Some of the more advanced lice are already on the flanks of the fish and have begun grazing on its surface mucus. Later, they will munch their way into the skin and begin eating the surface muscle. This photo shows chemical treatment for sea lice in action. The containers on the boat, labelled Aqua Pharma, that's Pharma with a PH, have brought along a large quantity of hydrogen peroxide to dose the salmon in situ. A single treatment takes 122 tons of the stuff. Because the cages are made of nets consisting mainly of holes, it will not be possible to recover the H2O2, which will soon have drifted into the sea, presumed dispersed and safely diluted to extinction. Ha! I'm not persuaded that safely is an appropriate word here. The farmers and the authorities seem to think it's safe practice, but scientific research disagrees. Still, the farmers proudly carry on with the confidence that if they apply other, more toxic chemicals in the same manner, the ecological hazards will be potentially many times greater. So they're actually being kind to the marine environment. Now, the point here is that when treating for sea lice is necessary, the infestation must have become so severe that the caged salmon are being nibbled beyond marketable quality. Actually, they're being eaten alive, and many may die. But market first, eh? At the same time, their numbers have become so great that the population is continuous with the sea beyond the cages. Indeed, sea lice will be dispersing in huge numbers from the farm. Fjørtoft et al. Have recently shown that they spread throughout the Atlantic. Far from being geographically localised, the sea lice problem is ubiquitous, indeed pandemic. Research conducted primarily in Canada and Norway has shown that salmon farm-generated sea lice are at least a significant contributory factor in declines in wild salmon populations such as are illustrated here. Here are some of the scientists dedicated to these studies. The corpus of peer-reviewed publications on the subject is prodigious. The Kirkashek lab in Toronto has to date conducted 59 studies on sea lice reported in the most reliable scientific journals. Many of those papers unequivocally substantiate the sea lice link between salmon farms and declines in populations of wild salmon in Canada. Thorstad and Finstad have discussed similar results for sea trout, complementing the work on Atlantic and Pacific salmon. Scotland has produced little equivalent research, a deficiency routinely used by Marine Scotland, the government agency responsible for the safety of Scottish seas, to excuse their claim to be unable to regulate Scottish salmon farming because of the lack of data. It seems that because they have not carried out or commissioned the research in Scotland, there has been no applicable research. Well, duh! In spite of this rich corpus of scientific research, some influential people maintain that there is a controversy regarding the impacts of salmon farms on populations of wild salmonids. Inasmuch as there is a controversy, it seems to be created by and large by unsubstantiated denials by salmon farming spokespersons, as here on the BBC's Country File of 2013, in which Tom Heap interviewed the CEO of the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation, Scott Landsborough, whose successors maintain the same evidence-contradicting denials.
So, what does the Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation have to say about that? Scott, are lice from your farms killing wild salmon?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it, but there's no empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case.
Why then does the industry spend millions of pounds each year on chemicals to treat lice?
We want to ensure that we have healthy fish. I mean, that's the key to our future. We want to have a sustainable industry here. It is a challenge, but it's a challenge for the wild fish.
I think we can deduce from Landsborough's tone, body language, palpable hesitancy and premeditated use of special words here what his reply really means. When asked directly,
Scott, are lice from your farms killing wild salmon?
He replies with a firm no, indicating factuality, hastily qualified by an indication that it could be his personal opinion.
No, I wouldn't say so.
He then adds some shaky assertions of which he is quite evidently, shall we say, unsure.
There's a lot of discussion about it, but there's no empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case.
An uncomfortable denial of the evidence for lice from fish farms killing wild salmon that really does exist, and did at the time. What he could have argued is that the proportion of impacts on wild salmon caused by fish farm sea lice might not at that point in time have been precisely quantified, but instead he opted to adjust the truth. As a spokesman, it was not his most glorious moment. Special words? Note that in using the word sustainable, he was referring to the sustainability of his industry, not, as the unwary might automatically understand, anything related to the natural environment. Let's hear his assertions again and reassess the tone of his delivery.
Scott, are lice from your farms killing wild salmon?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it, but there's no empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case.
Sorry, Scott. There is plenty of empirical evidence in the form of scientific data published in reputable journals since 2005. Let's have your peer-reviewed evidence of the contrary. A major obstacle to saving Scottish wild salmon from extinction has, for years, been Marine Scotland's reluctance to advise the Scottish Government that fish farm-generated sea lice are at the very least in part responsible. They have simply refused to acknowledge the validity of non-Scottish research. It's been almost as bad as Scott Lansborough's skewed opinion that there's no empirical evidence. There is, lots of it. It's contrary evidence that's lacking. During the 2018 Scottish Parliament's inquiry into salmon farming, Mark Harvey of the Highland Council stated,
Marine Scotland are a consultee for us, but of course are not in a position to support or object on sea lice impacts on wild fish, because that scientific data is not there in order to allow them to defend that should it be challenged.
We have heard this defence on numerous occasions, sometimes leavened with the rider that what data there are, i.e. mostly from Norway and Canada, do not represent conditions in Scotland and, therefore, would not be appropriate. Anyone with an appreciation of the quality of the relevant scientific literature will not be persuaded by such excuses. Excellent research by Norwegian and Canadian scientists is surely worthy of application to what is the same tragic situation in Scotland, not just a despondent shrug. However, even if there truly are no data on such an important topic, then, in accordance with international law, the precautionary principle should be invoked. Apparently not when regulating salmon farming in Scotland. It was interesting to hear Mr. Harvey explain his personal opinion of the precautionary principle, which suggested he would prefer to contravene a United Nations resolution because it would make his job easier. When he was asked by the committee's convener if he could illustrate examples of the precautionary principle being deployed in the expansion of the aquaculture sector, he did not present any. Instead, his circumlocutory reply was essentially that, his words, plus my interpretation, he does not like the precautionary principle because it is an inconvenience in his planning officer's decision-making process.
On the precautionary principle, of course, is embedded in European environmental legislation, so we obviously can't ignore it. It's a principle that's applied. I have to say, speaking as a planner, I don't like it. I don't like it as an approach because I think we're actually paid to take decisions, and those decisions, in my case, obviously are we recommending approval or are we recommending refusal for definite, clear, evidenced reasons, and not because we're not sure, so we don't feel like taking a decision.
Does this mean that the Highland Council's planning department ignores issues that demonstrably should invoke the precautionary principle and therefore never implements it? In this parliamentary inquiry, the Environment Committee heard witnesses contend that the precautionary principle had not been applied during the 16 years of salmon farming expansion between 2002 and 2018. The convener concluded that over that period there appears to have been too little focus on the application of the precautionary principle in the development and expansion of the sector. For many years we the public have been asking, with good ecological reasoning, why should that be? And we've been consistently ignored. The precautionary principle states, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Surely Mark Harvey should welcome the existence of the precautionary principle, which would allow him to make his decisions decisively in accordance with the United Nations European and British law. When refusing planning permissions in which the role of sea lice is in question, he should state with confidence that one of his statutory consultees, Marine Scotland, has informed him that it does not have scientific data available. Nonsense, as we know. Since there was a strong element of concern about sea lice in the context of that discussion, sea lice constitute, to quote from the definition of the precautionary principle, threats of serious or irreversible damage, so that lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. In this instance, cost-effective measures would mean refusal of planning permission. In other words, if there is any doubt, stop work until that doubt has been resolved. If Mark Harvey and Marine Scotland consider there are no data, which demonstrably there are aplenty, then it should be not only mandatory but also convenient for them to apply the precautionary principle decisively, with no detriment to the planning process or to Mr. Harvey's reputation. Marine Scotland has always contributed to research by publishing wild salmon catch data. It is demonstrably not the best research, but here is the most recent, which if correct shows an alarming trend. Indeed, I think there can be little doubt that something is killing the wild salmon, even if the causes are multifarious and difficult to resolve. This graph, which ought to have been plotted as a regression, clearly shows a trajectory towards extinction which definitely needs action, not a corporate shrug. However, at long last, this year 2021, Marine Scotland has acknowledged that there is a link between salmon farm-generated sea lice infestations and declining wild salmon populations. It's such a significant statement that I'll read out the main conclusion. With relish. Section 6. Conclusions. The body of scientific information indicates that there is a risk that sea lice from aquaculture facilities negatively affect populations of salmon and sea trout on the west coast of Scotland. Risks can be mitigated by reducing sea lice on farms or locating farms in areas that reduce interactions with wild salmonids. I suggest that last bit isn't an invitation to salmon farmers to keep pumping toxins into Scottish sea lochs, and not necessarily that they should move their cages out to sea when closed containment tank systems could replace their nets. That conclusion is a very welcome statement of fact, but it's not news. Just a cursory literature search found papers in top scientific journals that exposed the problem, even specified in their titles, from as long ago as 2005. And these are just 4 out of a huge number of studies. Remember this? If not, please see my main salmon farming video. Will spokespersons for the industry continue to deny that their fish farms are responsible for the sea lice problem? They have rarely, probably never, supported those denials with plausible references to independent scientific research. They've relied upon stuff like Marine Scotland's probably politically motivated reluctance to get involved. I can think of only one example of a structured discussion, and that was self-published and not peer-reviewed. That was Martin Jaffa's remarkably unpersuasive book, which is regularly backed up by allegations and insults in his blog Relaxation, but very little else. I may say insults because some of them have been aimed at me. On the other hand, as we've seen, there's an abundance of scientific research reported in the most reputable of journals that presents a case for deep concern that there is a causal connection between sea lice generated and multiplied in salmon farms and declines in wild populations of several salmon species and sea trout. Many of the relevant papers are listed as full references and hyperlinks in documents available at the Scottish Salmon Think Tank's website. As well as the many research papers, at least 2 major reports contradict the industry's denials. Then, based on the same science, plus their own research, the Scottish Parliament's 2018 inquiry into aquaculture reform arrived at similar conclusions. One wonders why the wealth of highly competent research carried out in Norway and Canada should not, until March 2021, have provided Marine Scotland with sufficient evidence to enable responsible extrapolative thinking. Back in 2013, Scott Landsborough publicly denied the existence of evidence. In 2018, Mark Harvey publicly supported the non-implementation of existing evidence. But way back before 2007, that evidence was emerging and getting published. Most recently, in May 2021, while providing evidence for multiple resistance of sea lice to the chemicals used in their increasingly failing control, Fjørtoft et al. Have once again confirmed the threat to wild salmon of sea lice emanating from salmon farms. By now the evidence ought to be overwhelming. Not ought to be, is. Fish farm generated sea lice are exterminating wild salmon worldwide. QED. The problem, along with 14 others discussed in my main video, is caused by the nets, which are full of holes. There is no barrier between the farmed salmon and the wild fishes. Nothing to prevent problems within the nets finding their way out of the nets. The solution is obvious. Tanks. As with the sea lice research, there is no ambiguity in the conclusions reached here. We may confidently extrapolate. Salmon farming as currently conducted concentrates and dispenses pests and diseases that have impacts on populations of wild salmonid fishes, which means, not to put too fine a point on it, potential extinction. Scott Landsborough's assertion,
There's no empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case.
Echoed by Marine Scotland,
because that scientific data is not there.
Has been conclusively proven wrong. And it was wrong when they said it. How could these professionals have been so badly mistaken? I'd better keep my private thoughts on this matter to myself, but you needn't. This presentation has been an extended re-evaluation of a section in my main YouTube video on the Octatire Academy channel, which covers a diversity of biological, musical and other topics. So please visit, you might find something there that interests you. Other people have.